Hello and welcome back, guys. We're now starting a part 2 of Pale Face, Black Eyes, written by Tripleatomic. You can find author's profile link in the description. Let's begin chapter 6. We all rot. Izuku's days began to fall into a gentle rhythm, a welcome contrast to the uncertainty that had defined so much of his life. Every morning before school, he made his way to the nurse's office. The air inside was always warm, a soft glow from the lamp on Ms. Shuzenji's desk casting a comforting light across the room. The walls were lined with posters offering various health tips, but it was the quiet presence of Ms. Shuzenji herself that made the room feel safe. She always greeted Izuku with a smile, her expression never failing to soften at the sight of him. It became their routine. He'd walk in, and she'd ask how he was doing, her voice gentle and without any hint of judgment. At first, Izuku was awkward, giving short, clipped answers, but over time he started to open up more. She listened, really listened, and never pushed him to say more than he was comfortable with. One morning, she caught him squinting at a particularly difficult math problem. Without a word, she wheeled over to his side, her presence calming. She offered to help, and after some hesitation, Izuku agreed. What began as occasional homework help quickly turned into a regular thing. She was patient, explaining concepts in a way that made sense to him, never making him feel stupid for not understanding right away. It wasn't long before she began bringing in books from her own home, thick volumes that covered everything from mathematics to science. She left them on the corner of her desk for Izuku to take at his leisure, trusting him to return them when he was finished. Each book came with a small note inside, words of encouragement scrawled in her neat handwriting. With her help, Izuku's grades began to improve, slowly at first, but steadily. He found himself actually understanding the material instead of just memorizing it to get by. The better his grades became, the more confidence he felt, and the more he began to enjoy school, not for the social aspect, which he still struggled with, but for the quiet satisfaction of learning something new. Outside of school, things were starting to look up as well. After losing his job at the diner, Izuku had managed to find work as a delivery boy for a small shop just around the block from his apartment. The pay wasn't much, but it was more than what he had been making before, and the work was steady. The owner was an older man who didn't ask many questions, which suited Izuku just fine. He spent his afternoons zipping around the neighborhood on his bike, delivering packages and groceries. The physical activity was a welcome distraction, something to focus on that wasn't tied to his more disturbing impulses. But it was Ms. Shuzenji who remained the constant in his life. In the back of his mind, a voice whispered that she was only kind to him because she didn't know what he was really like, what he was capable of when the hunger took over. But for now, that voice had been quieted, drowned out by the warmth of her presence and the genuine care she showed him. For the first time in a long while, Izuku felt like he had someone he could rely on. Ms. Shuzenji filled a void that had been gaping for years, the absence of a mother's gentle hand on his shoulder, the soothing voice that told him everything would be okay. 3 months passed in this way, each day a little brighter than the last. Izuku couldn't help but cling to the fragile happiness he had found, even though he knew better than to believe it would last forever. One morning, he pulled on his uniform, the fabric still smelling faintly of the detergent he had borrowed from his neighbor. He slipped on his shoes, no longer held together by duct tape, and grabbed his backpack from where it lay slumped by the door. The last remaining sunlight streamed through the cracks in the curtains, painting the small apartment in dark oranges and yellows. For a moment, Izuku paused, taking it all in. The sun had set long ago when Izuku finally stepped out of his house, the cool night air brushing against his face. It was just past 10:30 p.m., and the streets were mostly empty by this time on a Tuesday night, save for the occasional car passing by and the distant hum of the city that never truly slept. His shift at the takeout place started at 11, and he had made sure he had more than enough time to make the short walk. He pulled his hood up, adjusting it so that it hid the top half of his face. It wasn't unusual for him to be out at this hour, but he still preferred to stay as anonymous as possible. His life had taken on a semblance of a routine, a rhythm that kept him grounded, gave him something else to look forward to other than the gnawing, grating, hunger that he constantly tried to suppress. As he walked, the streets around him grew quieter, the soft glow of streetlights casting long shadows. Izuku's thoughts drifted to the nurse, Ms. Shuzenji, and how much her presence alone had come to mean to him. She was the only adult in his life still around who seemed to genuinely care about him, and he found himself looking forward to their morning conversations. She had become the constant in his life that he had so desperately wanted. Just as he was nearing the takeout place, a piercing scream cut through the silence, reverberating off the buildings, and stopping Izuku in his tracks. He clenched his fists, every instinct telling him to just keep walking, that this wasn't his problem to deal with, to ignore the sound and get to work. But there was something in that scream, a desperation that pulled him, forcing him to betray his own survival instincts and break into a run. As he raced toward the sound, it continued to grow louder and more distressed, as if whoever was screaming had been running for a very long time without any respite. A chill slithered down his spine, goosebumps forming across the exposed skin of his legs. Izuku's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the woman, Ms. Shuzenji. Her usually calm, kind brown eyes were wide with terror, tears freely streaming down her face. He could see a dark bruise forming on her left cheek, the size and shape of a fist. The sight of Izuku's initial plan to approach quietly, to use the element of surprise to his advantage, was ruined by Ms. Shuzenji's cries. The man turned to face him, his expression contorting to a sneer. "What do you want, brat? Go play hero somewhere else, while I'm feeling nice," the man scoffed at him, tightening his grip on the woman's hair. Ms. Shuzenji took advantage of the momentary distraction that Izuku had created, kicking the man hard in the groin and wrenching herself from his grip. She stumbled toward Izuku, grabbing his arm and trying to pull him away. "We need to go, Izuku. You can't fight him, he'll kill you." But Izuku didn't move. His eyes, glazed over, locked onto the man before he slowly turned his head to look at Ms. Shuzenji over his shoulder. "Why would I run away, when the person who hurt you is right there?" The words came out low and detached, sending a shiver down Ms. Shuzenji's spine. She tried to pull him away again, but it was as if his feet were stuck in wet cement. "Please, Izuku, let's just go." Izuku wasn't listening. He bent down, picking up a loose brick on the ground, his grip on it tightened as he straightened up. Ms. Shuzenji's pleas became frantic, but he no longer heard them. All that mattered to him was making sure that this man was never given the chance to hurt anyone again. With a sudden burst of speed, Izuku sprinted at the man, who was still recovering from the kick to his pages. The man swung at him, but Izuku easily sidestepped the punch, bringing the brick down on the man's knee. There was a sickening crunch as the man collapsed to the other knee, clutching his now shattered one in agony. Izuku didn't stop there. He swung the brick again in a wide arc, this time aiming for the man's head. The man tried to shield himself with his arms, but it was too late, the brick smashed into his skull, sending him sprawling to the pavement. But even as the man lay motionless, Izuku couldn't find it within himself to stop his onslaught. He straddled the man's chest, raising the brick high before bringing it down again and again. The man's face had caved in on itself. When Izuku finally stopped, the brick slipped from his bloodied fingers, clattering to the ground. He stood, breathing, the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. Eventually, he turned to Ms. Shuzenji, expecting to see relief, gratitude, something. But what he saw in her eyes was worse than anything he could have imagined: fear. Pure, unadulterated fear. Ms. Shuzenji was trembling, backing away from him as if he was the one to be afraid of, as if he was the monster. "Izuku, don't come any closer," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes had been blown wide again, filled with that same terror she had shown moments earlier, but this time it was directed at him. But she took a step back, nearly tripping over her own feet as she did. She took one last good look at him and bolted, sprinting full force down the road and leaving him behind with nothing more than an awkward glance thrown over her shoulder. Izuku's knees buckled, and his entire world spun violently around him as he fell to the cold, wet pavement, clutching his chest as he stared blankly ahead, unable to process what had just happened. For a moment, he just sat there, the cold air biting at his skin. Then, with an unsteady breath, he steadied himself on his feet and forced his body to move forward again, dragging his feet along the ground as fast as he could, not bothering to check the surroundings or try to hide his appearance. He had his job to get to, but he was more than sure he was already late for his shift. Still, he needed to try and keep this job. When he arrived at the takeout place, his new boss took one look at Izuku's disheveled appearance and shook his head. "You're fired," was all he said, his tone flat and uninterested in hearing whatever Izuku's excuse was. Izuku didn't have the energy to argue. He handed over the apron in his jacket pocket. He didn't regret what he did, despite everything that came afterward. Saving Ms. Shuzenji was something he would do 1,000 times over if given the chance. But the memory of her scream haunted him. It echoed in his mind, curling around his thoughts like a thick, oppressive fog. He couldn't shake the image of her terrified eyes, wide and pleading, as if she couldn't recognize him, or didn't want to. He kept telling himself it wasn't his fault. She had been hurt, she was bleeding, and he was the only one who could do anything. No one else had been there to stop the man from killing her, no one else but him. His hands clenched into fists, nails biting into his palms until the skin broke. The sharp pain grounded him, tethered him to the present, kept him from spiraling too far into his thoughts. But even that didn't last long. Izuku's breath came out shaky, uneven. He dragged it in slowly, holding it until his lungs burned, then let it out in a long, shuddering exhale. He had to believe that what he did was right. It had to be right. If it wasn't, what was the point of any of it? Ms. Shuzenji was alive because of him. She had to be grateful, even if she couldn't admit it right now. People reacted strangely to things like that. He had read about it. Shock, trauma, it messed with their heads, made them do and say things they didn't really mean. But why did it feel so wrong? The question gnawed at him, burrowing deep, until it settled like a heavy stone in his gut. He tried to push it away, tried to smother it with rationalizations. He wasn't the monster here. The man who attacked Ms. Shuzenji, that was the real monster. Izuku had stopped him, had made sure he couldn't hurt anyone ever again. That was what a hero would do. Wasn't it? He tried to settle into the routine of school, though nothing felt quite the same anymore. Every morning was the same, wake up in his cold, too quiet apartment, eat whatever scraps he could find, and trudge through the crowded streets to make it on time. He could feel the eyes on him, those suspicious stares from his classmates, but he forced himself to ignore them. He had more important things to focus on. The classroom was no refuge. The walls seemed to close in on him the moment he sat down at his desk, the chatter of his peers a constant buzz that he couldn't tune out, no matter how hard he tried. It felt like everyone was moving in slow motion around him, and yet his mind raced with thoughts he couldn't control. School felt like a distant blur. The days bled into each other, a monotonous cycle of lectures, assignments, and overhearing his classmates' half-hearted conversations. His fingers tightened around the edges of his desk. He needed to pay attention, knew he should be taking notes, but his mind was somewhere else, lost in a loop of fragmented thoughts, replaying the events of that night over and over again. The crackle of the loudspeaker pulled him from his thoughts, his head snapping up as the principal's voice filled the room. "Attention, students. I need to make an important announcement. Please listen carefully." An uneasy feeling settled in Izuku's stomach, a strange sense of dread washing over him. The principal's voice was heavy, serious, as if he were about to say something that would change everything. "I regret to inform you all that we have received some very bad news. Our beloved nurse, Ms. Shuzenji, is gone. She passed away last night. There's no easy way to say this, and I know this will come as a shock to many of you. Ms. Shuzenji was a kind and caring soul who always put others before herself, and she will be deeply missed." The words hung in the air, meaningless, as if spoken in a language Izuku couldn't understand. But slowly, painfully, the reality of what had been said began to sink in. Gone. Dead. Never coming back. The words didn't register at first. They couldn't. His mind refused to process them. Ms. Shuzenji was gone. No. No, that wasn't right. She was alive, he had saved her, he had made sure she would be okay. But, people don't come back like Izuku does. Izuku's breath hitched, a cold sweat breaking out across his skin. His hands flew to his ears, trying to clean out the sound, trying to undo what he'd just heard. But the cries of his classmates, the gasps and sobs, only confirmed it. They knew. They all knew. But it all felt so distant, so far away, like he was trapped behind a thick wall of glass, watching everything play out from some disconnected place. His head began to swim with thoughts that were too loud, too chaotic to make sense of. All of his efforts, for nothing. She was gone. He couldn't save her after all. Useless. Worthless. Monster. Killer. The words played on a loop, drilling into his skull until he thought he might go mad from the noise of it. But then, suddenly, it stopped. Everything went silent. Izuku's breath steadied, his pulse slowing as the noise around him faded into nothingness. He could see his classmates moving, see their lips moving as they spoke, their faces twisted in grief and shock, but he couldn't hear any of it. There was just silence, a blessed, eerie silence that wrapped around him like a comforting embrace. He liked it. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't overwhelmed by the constant barrage of sensory input. The world was muted, dull, like someone had turned down the volume on reality. Izuku just sat there, staring blankly at the front of the room, his mind blissfully empty. He couldn't think, couldn't feel. There was no guilt, no regret, no fear, only a hollow stillness that settled deep in his bones. He didn't have to justify anything to himself, didn't have to keep convincing himself that what he did was right. It didn't matter anymore. Nothing did. The bell rang, signaling the end of the class, but Izuku didn't move. He remained seated, his gaze distant, as his classmates filed out of the room, leaving him alone in the quiet. It was better this way. Ms. Shuzenji had been wrong. She hadn't understood what he was trying to do, hadn't seen that he was only trying to help. But that was okay. He didn't need her approval, didn't need anyone's approval. He was going to be a hero one day, the one who was made to make the tough choices for others, who did what had to be done, no matter the cost. Because in the end, heroes weren't remembered for the lives they saved. They were remembered for those they beat, how they could instill fear into the hearts of villains by taking down even the strongest of them. Heroes never failed, never faltered, never let themselves lose to those who threatened the things they held dear. So, he held on to that justifying, rationalizing thought until it became almost comforting. He was a hero. He had to be. And heroes don't regret saving people. Even at the cost of others. And if that made him a monster, so be it. He'd just show everyone that monsters can become heroes too. Chapter 7, Taste the Spoils of the Rotten Fruit. So, you're all third years now and it's about time to start thinking seriously about your futures and what you're going to do with your lives. I'd pass out career aptitude tests, but what's the point? The teacher flung a handful of papers into the air, scattering them like confetti. A laugh bubbled up from him, light and dismissive. I know you all want to be heroes. The class erupted in response, a spontaneous display of quirks lighting up the room. One student sprouted extra arms, another's skin turned to stone, while another floated a few inches off the ground. The cacophony of noise and the flash of powers would have once overwhelmed Izuku, but he had learned how to manage the onslaught of stimuli over the years. He'd gotten better at reducing the world around him to something more manageable, focusing on the details that mattered. Sitting near the back, Izuku kept his gaze fixed on his desk, idly scribbling in his notebook. His classmates' quirks whirled around him, each one more flashy and ridiculous than the last. They were all practically useless in his opinion, illusions of strength with no substance behind them. Katsuki Bakugo, seated near the front, shot up from his chair, an air of superiority radiating off him. "Don't lump me in with these rejects, sensei. I'm the real deal. These losers would be lucky to become sidekicks for some busted D-list hero." Izuku didn't even need to look up to agree with Katsuki. It was true. The quirks in this room had no business being anywhere near hero work. But as expected, the class didn't take kindly to being outright insulted. Murmurs of dissent spread quickly, students firing back with weak retorts, calling Katsuki a JRK or worse. Katsuki's eyes flared with annoyance. "Shut up. You all know I'm aiming for you, high school. You think you can compete with me?" The room fell into a tense silence. The mere mention of you was enough to cow the rest of them. Katsuki's reputation was well known, and the idea that any of them could match his ambition seemed laughable. The students exchanged uneasy glances, some mumbling about the difficulty of the UA entrance exam. Katsuki sneered, basking in their uncertainty. "I aced the mock exam, and I'm gonna surpass even All Might as the top hero." The teacher, who had been watching the scene unfold with mild amusement, chimed in. "Oh, by the way, it looks like Midoriya also wants to go to you. Hi." The effect was immediate. Every eye in the room snapped to Izuku, whispers spreading like wildfire. They didn't know that he could hear every word, even those spoken under their breath. "He's insane if he thinks they'll even let him take the exam. You might arrest him on the spot. He'll never make it." Izuku didn't move, didn't react. The words washed over him, as hollow and meaningless as the powers they wielded. He'd heard it all before, seen the way they looked at him like he was something less than human. Still, he said nothing. No point in defending himself against people whose opinions didn't matter. But out of the corner of his eye, he caught Katsuki's stare, their gazes locking for a brief moment. Neither moved, both holding their ground in the silent exchange, a wordless challenge hanging in the air. Eventually, the teacher broke the moment, asking Katsuki to take his seat so the lesson could continue. As the day drew to a close, Izuku packed his things, his focus split between the notebook in his hand and the combat video playing on his phone. Fighting had become more than just a way to survive, it was an art, one he'd decided to master. He'd been taking it more seriously ever since she died. He couldn't afford to brutalize people anymore, not if he wanted to keep a low profile, but he could still be effective, still instill the kind of fear that would make others think twice before crossing him. But as he prepared to head home, a familiar shadow loomed over his desk. Izuku didn't need to look up to know who it was. Katsuki's hand was already crackling with tiny explosions, the heat searing the edges of Izuku's notebook. Before he could react, Katsuki slammed the notebook down and let his quirk loose, the pages curling and blackening under the intense heat. Without a word, Katsuki snatched the charred notebook and flung it out the window, a smirk playing on his lips as he watched it spiral toward the ground below. But Izuku was faster. In a blur of movement, he was halfway out of the window, arms stretched out to snatch the notebook between his pointer finger and thumb. His other hand gripped the window frame tightly, one foot perched precariously on the edge. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Izuku hung there, suspended between the classroom and the empty air outside, holding his ruined notebook like it was the most natural thing in the world. He pulled himself back inside with a practiced ease and stuffed the notebook into his backpack without a word. Katsuki stared at him, incredulous. The anger that had been simmering just below the surface flared up again, his composure slipping. "You really think you can make it into you, he spat, his voice low and dangerous. "Give it up already. You know they wouldn't accept someone like you." Izuku remained silent, his expression unreadable. He wasn't going to rise to the bait, not this time. Katsuki's irritation grew. He took a step closer, lowering his voice even further. "There may be a way you could get in after all, you know," he mused. Izuku glanced up, humoring him. "How?" The grin that came to Katsuki's face was anything but friendly. Do the heroes a favor and take a swan dive off the roof. It'll save us the trouble of taking out another shitty villain later on. Izuku's body moved before his mind caught up. The sharp crack of his fist connecting with Katsuki's nose echoed in the classroom, shocking those who were still making their way out of the room, including himself. He hadn't meant to hit him, if anyone could believe that. He thought he was past letting others provoke him like this, but clearly, Izuku stood there, frozen, staring down Katsuki, his hand still held out in the punching motion. He could feel his breath coming hard and fast, his chest heaving as he struggled to rein in the adrenaline surging through him. For a moment, everything else faded away, the classroom, the stares of his classmates, the dull throb of his knuckles. All that existed was the raw emotions that had driven him to lash out, and the realization that he had given into them. Without another word, Izuku tore out of the room, not stopping until he reached the water fountain near the underpass he always took back on his way back to where he slept. He didn't have a home, not one he could call his own anymore. Steady income had been nearly impossible for him to come by in the past 6 years, and with no income, that meant no apartment. He'd lost the rights to the place a week after being laid off. Since then, Izuku was what some would call a nomad, though he knew the truth of it all. He was homeless, sleeping in places long forgotten about alongside the rats, the bugs, and the cold that had been abandoned there too. He finally slowed down as he neared the entrance of the underpass, the lactic acid building up in his legs from exertion. The brick walls stood more than a meter above him, a familiar sight that only added to the weight pressing on his chest. He stopped in front of them, trying to catch the breath that had been escaping him for some time now, but there was a lump in his throat that wouldn't go away. The anger hadn't left him, it had just shifted, turning inward, festering. Izuku ped the same fist he had used on Katsuki back and drove it into the brick wall. The impact reverberated through his bones, leaving a crude imprint of his hand in the wall, a small hole roughly the shape of his fist. When he pulled his hand back, he inspected it, the skin over his knuckles was no longer intact. It was an angry red with trails of a deeper shade trailing down from it, dropping onto the concrete below like rain. A few moments later, it healed back over, the wound closing as if it had never been there in the first place. With a resigned sigh, Izuku turned and headed into the tunnel, the clicking of his heels bouncing off the walls. He had barely taken a few steps when something cold and slimy wrapped around his ankle. He stilled, unable to move any further, hearing a voice that seemed to bubble up from the depths of the sewer below. An extra-large meat suit. Not my first choice, but beggars can't be choosers. Izuku craned his neck around, his eyes widened every so slightly as he was met with the sight of a towering figure made of a dark green sludge. The creature, person, had a large set of sharp teeth that were visible in the dark due to their bright color, and its eyes, round, red. Izuku wasn't impressed with the attempt on his life. Sure, he could feel the sludge filling his lungs, but it wasn't as if he really needed to breathe, just another new aspect of his quirk that had been no fun discovering. This villain believed he was suffocating him, but all it was doing was irritating Izuku. The stench was awful, worse than anything he'd experienced in his entire life. With a grunt, he willed to get an arm free and reached for one of the villain's floating red eyes. What are you doing? Let go of my eye, the sludge's mouth demanded, panic creeping into his voice as Izuku's fingers closed around the eyeball. Izuku didn't bother himself with forming a response. He tightened his grip and pulled back, tearing the eye free from the villain's body. The creature let out a shriek, recoiling as soon as the eye was ripped away. Izuku didn't hesitate as he crushed the eye in his hand, feeling it squish and crumble in his grip. Izuku made a disgruntled noise, adjusting the straps of his backpack as he stepped over the mess he had made of the villain. He stuffed his hands in his pockets and resumed the long walk back, already having moved on from the encounter. But as he neared the exit of the tunnel, he could feel the temperature rising exponentially, the air growing thick with heat. A bright light shone at the end of the tunnel, flickering like a flame. When Izuku got closer, he saw it. He fought the instinct to flinch away from it. Fire, not just any fire, but the kind that formed the facial hair of none other than Endeavor, the #2 pro hero in all of Japan. The hero's presence dominated the space, his towering figure radiating an oppressive heat like the sun as he stood at the other entrance to the underpass, searching for something. Izuku tried to keep his composure, even as he felt a twinge of awe at being in the presence of his favorite hero. Though he was just slightly taller than Endeavor, it didn't make the pro any less imposing. The fact that Izuku, at 14, was already taller than the hero was a strange realization for him. Endeavor was a giant in his mind, both literally and physically. "Boy," Endeavor's deep voice rumbled, his eyes fixed on Izuku. "Have you seen a villain made of sludge around here? I've been tracking him and it led me here." Izuku tried to stay calm, though his mind raced. "Yeah, I took care of him," he replied, keeping his tone steady as he gestured back toward the tunnel. "He's all over the walls in there." Endeavor raised an eyebrow, surprised but not entirely convinced. "You handled him on your own?" Izuku nodded, trying not to let his nerves show. "It wasn't that tough," he said without thinking. "He made his weaknesses too obvious." Endeavor cut him off, his tone stern. "Fighting without a license is reckless, not to mention illegal. You could have made the situation worse. I should have you arrested." He paused, then added, almost begrudgingly, "But you seem like you can handle yourself well enough." Izuku's ears went pink at the unexpected praise. "Thanks," he mumbled, trying to hide his embarrassment. He quickly fumbled with his backpack, pulling out a notebook and flipping to a blank page. Could I get your autograph?" Endeavor sighed, clearly not thrilled about the delay, but he took the notebook. "Don't make a habit of this," he muttered as he signed the page, his large hand almost engulfing the notebook. Izuku watched in awe, hardly believing it was happening. When Endeavor handed the notebook back, he tried to stammer out a thank you, but the hero had already turned away, heading into the tunnel to deal with the remains of the villain. Izuku stood there for a moment, staring at the signature, feeling the warmth of the hero's lingering flames. Then, with a quiet breath, he tucked the notebook back into his bag and continued on his way, a faint smile pulling at the corners of his lips. Izuku sat through the graduation ceremony at Aldera Junior High, giving little attention to the formalities. Students shuffled up to the stage in neat lines, receiving their diplomas with rehearsed bows. Polite applause followed each name, the principal's monotone voice droning on with encouragement and advice for the future. Izuku couldn't recall much of what was said, the words didn't quite reach his ears. The entire event felt distant, like he was watching it from behind a pane of glass, not really there. He blinked, and suddenly it was over. Standing outside the school, diploma in hand, Izuku stared up at the sky. The sun was just beginning to dip, casting a soft glow over the grounds. He didn't bother with a folder or anything, he just folded the diploma in half and shoved it into his pocket, indifferent to the sounds of the paper crumpling up. It didn't matter. The others were all clumped together in their groups, chatting and laughing, making plans for the summer. But none of them even glanced his way. It was like there was an invisible force field around him, keeping everyone at a distance. There was a 10-meter radius of empty space surrounding him, and it wasn't an accident. Izuku turned and started walking. The noise of the schoolyard faded as he headed toward Tatooine Station. His hands were stuffed in his pockets, fingers brushing against the diploma. The crinkle of paper was grounding, a reminder that this wasn't some nightmare he'd wake up from to find himself back in a basement clutching an Endeavor plush. The station was still under repair, debris scattered here and there, remnants of a recent villain attack. Most of the damage had been cleared, thanks to quirks making the cleanup quicker and more efficient. But Izuku didn't board any of the trains. Instead, he kept walking, heading further into the city. Muzutafu had its rougher areas, places where people didn't flinch away from him or cast sideways glances. It was easier to exist here, to blend in without feeling like he was constantly being observed. Here, he wasn't something to be gawked at, he was just another face among many. He wandered until he reached a small restaurant, a dingy little place with a cardboard sign in the window that simply read, "Restaurant," in red kanji. The door jingled as he entered, and the workers greeted him in unison, a simple, practiced routine. They seated him without fuss, a young lady approaching his table with a menu. But before she could say anything, the owner, an older man with a gruff demeanor, appeared. "What'll it be?" the man asked bluntly, not one for pleasantries. Izuku fished out a crumpled wad of bills and coins from his pocket, counting out 3,678 yen. "The largest cut of beef you have," he said, "cooked blue rare." The owner raised an eyebrow, muttering something about how strange Izuku was, but he didn't argue. He disappeared into the back, and less than a minute later, he returned with the order. The steak was barely seared, nearly raw, just the way Izuku liked it. The man sighed as he set the plate down. "I'll never understand how you enjoy that, but money's money." He gave a small bow to Izuku, saying, "Thank you for the business." Izuku nodded in acknowledgement, digging in. It wasn't much, just an abandoned building he'd found, but he'd made it somewhat comfortable. After changing out of his graduation uniform into something more relaxed, Izuku examined himself in the cracked mirror. The clothes hung loosely off his tall, bony frame. He always had trouble finding things that fit, anything smaller than a 3XL turned into a CRP top on him, and he was thankful the shorts he wore had a drawstring to keep them from slipping off his narrow hips. Izuku dropped onto the worn mattress, letting out a long sigh as he tried to settle in. The springs dug into his back, but he'd gotten used to that by now. Yet, despite his exhaustion, he couldn't get comfortable. He shifted around, trying to find a position that didn't irritate him, but it was no use. Finally, he groaned out loud, dragging a hand down his face. He was hungry again. The steak had barely taken the edge off, and now the familiar gnawing sensation in his gut was back. It made sense, really, his metabolism was through the roof, and it took more than one meal to keep him satisfied. Izuku sat up, frustration bubbling in his chest. He was tired, hungry, and fed up with everything. But there was no use complaining. With another sigh, Izuku got to his feet. He threw on a dark-colored sweatshirt, yanking the hood over his unruly hair, and shoved his feet into his dress shoes, not bothering to put on socks. The shoes weren't ideal for this situation, one where he wanted to be ignored and unseen, but they'd have to do. It wasn't like he had no money to afford anything else. He stepped over to the window, lifting it open with a creak before slipping outside onto the fire escape. The rusted metal rattled under his weight as he descended, moving carefully but quickly. When he reached the second floor, he stopped and peeked over the railing, gauging the distance to the ground. It didn't seem too far. He jumped over the top bar and dropped down, but the moment he hit the pavement, a stabbing pain shot up his legs. His ankles snapped under the impact, sending him sprawling to the ground with a sharp hiss. He lay there for a moment, waiting for the inevitable. The bones began to mend back together by themselves in a rapid fashion, the pain subsiding just as quickly as it had come. Too far up, Izuku. Too far, he muttered to himself as he hoisted himself up with little help from the wall, testing the weight on his newly healed ankles. Satisfied, he tucked his hands into his pockets and started walking, sticking to the interconnecting back alleys where no light dared to shine. He walked aimlessly, the city's underbelly all too familiar to him by now. It wasn't long before he happened upon a man slumped up against a wall, clearly strung out on something. The guy's heartbeat was weak, barely there. Izuku could already smell the rot settling down in his veins. He cursed under his breath, frustrated with his luck. Drag addicts were second in awful tasting only to those with tattoos, bitter, and rancid, leaving him to deal with the nauseating high from whatever CRP they had in their system. But his stomach growled, loud and insistent, reminding him that he didn't have the luxury of being picky. Izuku crouched low, glancing around out of habit. The alley was empty, save for him and the junkie. Reluctantly, he pulled the needle from the man's arm, tossing it aside. It clattered against the pavement, rolling into a puddle. With another sigh, Izuku grabbed the guy by the hair and slammed his head against the ground. The man groaned the first time, but after the second and third blows, he was silent. Maybe Izuku had blocked out the sound, or maybe the guy had died, he didn't have it in him to check. There was a crack on the fourth that let Izuku know the skull had split open, and he dug his clawed fingers into the fresh crack, prying it open. He scooped out the brain in small chunks, biting into it with little hesitation. The taste was as bad as he was expecting, a sharp bitterness that made him GG slightly, but he forced it down. Kind of like eating sashimi as a kid, he mused to himself, his voice low and detached. The thought made him pause, remembering the sticky rice that usually came with it. He missed rice. He missed regular food. He was lost in thought, more focused on the meal than his surroundings. Izuku didn't hear the man approach, didn't see his shadow creeping down the alley. One moment he was alone, gnawing on what was left of the junkie's brain, and the next, there was a voice in front of him, casual and almost amused. "Nice outfit you've got there," the voice drawled. "Really, unique style. Shorts, a sweatshirt, and dress shoes. Bold choice." Izuku froze, his fingers tightening around the half-eaten chunk of flesh in his hand. He slowly lifted up his head, his eyes narrowing as he took in the newcomer. The guy, a young man maybe a few years older than him, was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, his expression lying somewhere between bemusement and apathy. He was reasonably tall and lean, with black hair that spiked out wildly around his head. But what really drew Izuku's attention was the purple, gnarled skin that covered the majority of his face, neck, and arms, held in place by crude surgical staples and hoop piercings. The rest of his skin was pale, a nice complement to the dark blue jacket and breathes he wore. His turquoise eyes were thin, almost hidden beneath heavy lids, but they gleamed with a strange light, almost like he was enjoying the sight before him. "Yeah, real unique," the man continued, not missing a beat. "But you know what really brings it all together? The way you're eating that guy and comparing it to sushi so casually. That's something else. What's it to you?" Izuku shot back defensively, his voice rising to match the man. His voice seemed to make the man smile, although it wasn't entirely visible due to the scar that ran across his forehead. He tilted his head to the side ever so slightly, the faintest trace of a grin tugging at his lips. The motion brought his face closer to Izuku, making him feel uncomfortable. Who knew insane, attractive, and a cannibal could all describe one person? You might be the only one, though. The other cannibals I've met are either only one or two of them, not all three. The man raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth twitching into a smirk. Guess that makes you one of a kind, huh? Izuku's scowl deepened. He didn't know what this guy's deal was, but he wasn't in the mood for his bullshit. Especially if he was gonna try to play some kind of joke on him. "So. Did you want something from me?" The guy chuckled, the sound almost mocking, as he backed away from Izuku, putting some distance between them. He then threw Izuku's words back at him, smiling like he was proud of himself. "What's it to you?" He glanced over his shoulder, his expression fading slightly as if expecting something or someone to appear. Izuku strained his senses but heard, smelled, and saw nothing out of the ordinary. "Looks like I've overstayed my welcome." He turned to leave, tossing a final sardonic smile over his shoulder as he walked away. "See you later, sushi boy." Izuku watched him go, straining his neck, hoping to catch one last glimpse of his retreating form before disappearing around the corner. Something about the corner stirred up things within him, the stranger's turquoise eyes lingering in his mind. Even after he returned to his makeshift house, the man's smirk haunted him, slipping into his dreams and turning them into nightmares. That same night, and many nights after, those turquoise eyes followed him into his sleep, eventually being able to lull him to sleep, until finally, the dreams faded to a whisper, and Izuku finally let go. Chapter 8, Rotten Dreams and Broken Bones. Izuku stood in front of the mirror, unbuttoning the top two buttons of his shirt. It was stiff and ill-fitting, something that had belonged to a man even larger than he was, if that were even possible, but it would have to do. He brushed his fingers through his hair, attempting to tame the unruly black locks, but they stubbornly resisted his efforts. With a sigh, he gave up and slung his backpack over his shoulder. It was heavy with the weight of the textbooks he'd borrowed from the cram school, the ones that would hopefully fill in the gaps his junior high had left in his education. The streets were already crowded with people heading to work or school, and Izuku blended into the flow, just another body in the faceless crowd. The cram school wasn't far, a short walk through the bustling city, but each step felt heavier than the last. His mind was a whirl of formulas, dates, and equations, the things he had been cramming into his brain for weeks now. He had never been a stellar student, always struggling to keep up, but now he had no choice. If he didn't pass the written exam, it wouldn't matter how impressive his quirk was or how strong a villain he could defeat in combat. You wouldn't take him. The cram school was a nondescript building tucked between two taller ones, almost easy to miss if you didn't know where to look. Izuku pushed the door open and was greeted by the cool blast of air conditioning. The lobby was quiet, with a few students milling around, their faces buried in their books. Izuku didn't know any of them, but that was fine. He was used to being alone. "Midoriya, you're here early," a voice called out from behind the reception desk. Izuku turned to see one of the instructors, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and thick glasses. His name was Mr. Ikoma, and he was one of the few teachers who didn't look at Izuku with suspicion or disdain. Though, no matter how many times he told the man that he wanted to be addressed by only his first name, he refused to do so. He chose to not reply but gave Mr. Ikoma a small nod before heading towards the staircase. He didn't want to get caught up in small talk, not today. His mind was too full, too scattered, and he needed to focus. The classroom was almost empty when he arrived, just a few other early birds like him. Izuku took his usual seat near the back, where he could spread out his books and notes without bothering anyone. He pulled out his notebook, the pages filled with scribbles and annotations, and flipped to the section on mathematics. Numbers, just after English, had always been his weakest subject, and he needed all the time to prepare. As the minutes ticked by, more students trickled in, filling the room with the low buzz of conversation. Izuku kept his head down, focused on his work, tuning out the noise around him. The door creaked open one final time, and Izuku heard the familiar shuffle of Mr. Ikoma's footsteps. The classroom fell silent as the instructor cleared his throat and began the day's lesson. Izuku's pen moved quickly across the page, jotting down notes, his mind racing to keep up with the information being thrown at him. It was overwhelming, but in a way, it was also comforting. In the blink of an eye, hours had already passed by. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the desks. Sunlight had shifted from harsh midday rays to the softer, golden light of late afternoon. Izuku glanced at the clock on the wall. Only another 30 minutes until this session was over. He could feel the weight of the day pressing down on him, the hours of studying and the gnawing hunger in his gut combining to make his head spin. His stomach growled, loud enough that the girl sitting at the desk next to him glanced over. Izuku ignored her, flipping the page of his workbook. He couldn't afford to waste time. His grades had improved, sure, but that wasn't enough. If he wanted any chance of getting into UA, he had to keep pushing, keep clawing his way up from the bottom. The bell rang, signaling the end of the session. Izuku stuffed his books into his bag, slinging it over his shoulder as he stood. The other students filed out of the room, chatting quietly amongst themselves. Izuku stayed behind, waiting until the room had mostly cleared before he headed for the door. He had a routine now, one that he stuck to religiously. Cram school, food, training, then, the ring. Izuku, though it was extremely busy, easily fell in stride with the people rushing home from work or heading out for the night. He made his way to the convenience store, his footsteps quick and purposeful. The thought of eating made his stomach twist, but he knew he needed the fuel. He couldn't afford to be weak, not for what he had coming up for him later. He had to blink a few times when he walked in the convenience store as the fluorescent lighting inside was too much of a difference from the outside for him to adjust to immediately. Once settled, he walked in, heading straight for the refrigerated section. The selection was limited, but he didn't care. He grabbed a pack of nigiri and a bottle of water, paid for it, and then moved to the small seating area near the window. The chair creaked slightly as he sat down, the plastic tray hitting the table with a soft thud. Izuku ate with deliberate, measured movements, peeling the fish away from the rice and letting the cool flesh slide down his throat. It wasn't enjoyable, not really, but it was tolerable, and that was all he needed. As he ate, his thoughts drifted back to the cram school. He was still behind, but the gap was closing, and he could feel the progress in the way the material didn't seem as foreign as it once did. The teachers there were different, not weighed down by the expectations and prejudices he'd faced in junior high. It was strange, almost unsettling, to be treated like a normal student, to be given the same opportunities as everyone else. It made him realize just how badly he'd been cheated out of a proper education before. Izuku leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing as he stared out the window. The sky was tinged with the warm hues of sunset, the city beginning to glow with the soft light of early evening. His mind, however, was already moving ahead to what came next. The ring. He hadn't planned on getting involved with something so dangerous, but the allure of easy money had been too strong to resist. It wasn't like he could get killed, hurt, sure, but not killed. Not even if he wanted to. He had a goal, though, and he needed the cash. High was expensive, more than he'd ever imagined, and he wasn't about to let something like money get in his way. The fights were brutal, messy, and downright savage, but they were also a way to hone his skills. He couldn't afford to let this opportunity slip through his fingers. The last of the sushi disappeared as Izuku's thoughts circled back to the upcoming exam. It was only 9 months away now, and the pressure was mounting. He had to be ready, physically, mentally, in every way possible. By any means possible. Izuku gathered his things, crumpling the plastic tray into a ball before tossing it into the trash. As he left the store, the cool evening air washed over him, a welcome contrast to the stifling heat of the day. There was still time before the ring opened for the night, but he wasn't in a hurry. Izuku knew that once he stepped into that underground world, there was no going back. Each fight chipped away at something inside him, something he wasn't sure he'd ever get back. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that he won, that he survived, and that he got the money he needed. Everything else was secondary. His pace quickened as he moved through the streets, the city's pulse syncing with his own. The future was uncertain, filled with dangers he couldn't yet see. But Izuku Midoriya was used to that. He'd been walking a dangerous path for a long time now. The midnight air hung with a tangible humidity as Izuku wound his way through the labyrinthine-like back alleys of Mizurufu. The ruckus of the day faded with each step, replaced by the low murmur of distant voices and the occasional clatter of something that was meant to go unseen to those not involved. He moved with purpose, his footsteps muffled against the worn pavement, each turn taking him deeper into the underbelly of the city, a world far removed from the sanitized streets above. Finally, he reached his destination, a metal door that had long been rusted over set into the base of a dilapidated building. There was no sign, no indication of what lay beyond, but Izuku knew better. This was the place. He pushed the door open with a bit of trouble, the metal groaning in protest, and descended a narrow staircase. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened up into a large, cavernous room. The ceiling was low, pipes and exposed beams crisscrossing overhead, while the walls were lined with makeshift seating, rusted metal chairs, wooden crates, anything that could support the weight of a human, or human-adjacent, being. A crowd had already gathered, a seething mass of bodies pressed together, creating a sheen of sweat that clung to Izuku's skin. He stood at the edge of the room, his eyes scanning the scene with a mixture of caution and calculation. The crowd was a mix of hardened, desperate fighters and those who looked like they'd stumbled into this world by accident, their eyes wide with either fear, excitement, or necessity. Izuku felt a twinge of unease in his gut, but he shoved it down, burying it beneath the cold logic that had brought him here in the first place. He stood out in the crowd, taller and broader than most, his hair a dark, tangled mess that framed his sharp features. His eyes, however, betrayed him the apprehension in them, an instinctual alertness honed by years of living by himself with no one to watch his back for him. He'd been through hell before, and this place was no different. The rules were always simple: survive or don't. New meat, huh? The voice came from behind him, rough and gravelly, with a hint of amusement. Izuku turned to see a man approaching, a veteran of the ring by the looks of him. His face was a road map of scars, each one telling a story of survival, and his eyes were cold, assessing, as they raked over Izuku. "You got a name, kid?" the man asked, though his tone suggested he didn't really care. Izuku hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "Mutt," he replied, the words slipping out more like a growl. It wasn't what they called him outside these walls, but it felt fitting here, something familiar, but something that couldn't be tied back to him. The man snorted, the sound more like a cough than a laugh. "Mutt, huh? Fitting, I suppose." "Right," the man grunted, jerking his thumb toward the ring. "You're up." Izuku moved toward the ring, his chest beginning to PND in anticipation. The crowd shifted around him, parting like a wave, all eyes on the new contender. He could hear murmurs, speculation, bets being placed, the usual noise that accompanied these events. It was all background now, drowned out by the sound of his own breathing and the thud of his pulse in his ears. His opponent was already in the ring, pacing like a caged animal. The man was smaller, wiry, with a lean, coiled energy that spoke of speed and agility. His eyes gleamed with a wild light, and he flashed a grin as Izuku stepped into the ring. "Name's WHP," the man sneered, though Izuku didn't ask. "Don't worry, Mutt, I'll make it quick." Izuku didn't respond, his mind already calculating. This was his first fight here, and he had to make sure he made a great first impression. WHP's quirk was obvious from the way he moved, lightning fast, a blur of motion that would be hard to pin down. But Izuku had his own advantages: strength, endurance, and a grim determination that had seen him through far worse than this. The fight began without ceremony, no bell, no signal, just the sudden rush of movement as WHP lunged at him, a streak of speed aimed at his side. Izuku barely had time to react, twisting his body just enough to avoid the full impact, but still feeling the sting of a glancing blow. WHP didn't let up, racing around with jerky movements that made him difficult to track. He struck again and again, each hit coming from a different angle, a blur of motion that left Izuku struggling to keep up. He could feel the blows landing, sharp, precise, meant to wear him down rather than deliver a knockout punch. But while WHP was fast, he wasn't strong. Each hit felt like a needle prick, painful but not debilitating. Izuku gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay calm. He could take the hits, he'd been through worse. What he needed was an opening, just one moment where WHP slowed down enough for him to strike. Then it came, WHP overextended on a punch, his balance momentarily thrown off. Izuku seized the opportunity, lunging forward with all the force he could muster. His fist connected with WHP's midsection, and he felt the satisfying give of flesh and bone beneath his knuckles. The impact sent WHP staggering back, the air rushing out of his lungs in a gasp. Izuku didn't give him time to recover. He pressed the attack, a leg flying out, aimed right at the man's legs, the blows landed with a crack. WHP tried to dodge on his ruined legs, to slip away, but Izuku was relentless, his movements becoming more brutal, more savage, with each passing second. There was no strategy anymore. Finally, WHP collapsed, his body crumpling to the mat in a broken heap. Izuku stood over him, chest heaving, body shaking from the exertion. The fight was over, but the adrenaline still surged through him, leaving him feeling hollow and restless, like he hadn't truly won anything at all. The crowd erupted into cheers and jeers, money exchanging hands as bets were settled. Izuku barely registered it, his mind still focused on the sight of WHP lying motionless at his feet. He'd won, but the victory felt empty, like a box checked off a list rather than a triumph. Izuku stepped back, his breathing slowing, the hollow feeling in his chest growing with each passing second. This wasn't about glory, about proving himself, this was survival, pure and simple. Like a shark, he couldn't afford to stop moving, couldn't afford to hesitate, or he'd drown in the depths of this world he'd willingly stepped into. As the man with the scars approached him again, probably to discuss his next fight, Izuku barely heard him. His thoughts were already elsewhere, focusing on the next challenge, the next opponent. He couldn't stop, not now, not ever. There was still so much further to fall. Izuku slipped out of the fight ring as soon as he could after his latest fight, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridors as he retraced his steps back to the surface. The thrill of the fight had long since faded, replaced by a dull ache that radiated through his body, a reminder of the punishment he'd endured, and inflicted. The world outside felt muted, distant, as if he were moving through a haze. The city lights were harsh, too bright, and the noise of the streets grated on his frayed nerves. He kept his head down, shoulders hunched, avoiding eye contact with anyone he passed. The walk to his house was a blur, the familiar path offering no comfort. By the time he reached the door, his hands were trembling, not from fear, but from exhaustion, mental, physical, emotional. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the sound jarring in the quiet hallway. Inside, the small, run-down space greeted him with its usual emptiness. The room was just as he'd left it, a narrow bed with a lumpy mattress shoved against one wall, a battered table with one leg shorter than the others, and a tiny bathroom that looked like it hadn't seen proper cleaning in years. The walls were a sickly shade of yellow, stained with age and dampness, cracked spiderwebbing across the plaster. The only light came from a naked bulb hanging from the ceiling, flickering at its own whims as if unsure whether to stay on or finally give up. Izuku shut the door behind him, the click of the lock sounding too loud and the silence hovering over him. He leaned back against the door for a moment, eyes closed, trying to steady his breathing. The adrenaline that had carried him through the fight was gone, leaving him feeling hollow, as though something essential had been drained from him. When he finally moved, it was with a heaviness that seemed to weigh him down with every step. He pulled his shirt off, wincing as the fabric scraped over bruised skin. The dim light cast harsh shadows across his bare torso, highlighting the cuts and contusions that marred his flesh. Dark bruises were already blooming along his ribs, and a particularly deep gash near his temple pulsed with a dull, insistent pain. Izuku walked to the small, cracked mirror hanging over the sink in the corner of the room. The reflection that stared back at him was almost unrecognizable, his face nearly white, eyes sunken. He turned on the faucet, letting the water run until it was cold before splashing it on his face. The sting that came from that was grounding, pulling him back from the edge of the numbness that threatened to swallow him whole. Izuku reached for a towel, dabbing at the cut on his temple, doing his best not to wince. The stab wound was deeper than he'd realized, so much so that he could see the white of a bone in the mirror, probably would have felt it too if he was bold enough, and the skin around it was hot and swollen, refusing to knit back together as quickly as it should have been. "DMN it," he muttered, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. He hadn't thought much about it before, but now, staring at the sluggishly healing wound, he felt a pang of unease settle within him. His regeneration was slower, noticeably so. Normally, something like this would have been nothing more than a fleeting discomfort, but tonight, it lingered, throbbing with a stubbornness that gnawed at his mind. He wrapped a bandage around his temple, securing it with a rough knot, and dropped the bloodied towel into the sink. The room was silent, save for the sound of his breathing, and the faint hum of the flickering bulb overhead. Izuku leaned against the sink, gripping the edges tightly as he stared into the mirror, his gaze unfocused. Time had lost its meaning for him. Days blurred together in an endless cycle of fights, recovery, and more fights. The physical pain was manageable, he could grit his teeth and push through it, as he always had, but the weight pressing down on his mind was another matter. It was like a creeping fog, slowly smothering everything, making it harder to think, harder to feel. How much longer could he keep this up? How many more fights before his body finally gave out, before his mind snapped under the pressure? He didn't know, and he couldn't afford to care. Quitting wasn't a luxury people like him could hope to have. He was too far in, too deep in this nightmare of his own making. Izuku's eyes drifted back to his reflection, his expression blank. He wasn't sure who he was anymore, or if it even mattered. The person he'd been was gone, buried under layers of violence and self-deprecation, and what was left was little more than a shadow, driven by a relentless, unyielding need to justify the reasons he was still breathing while countless others were not. He pushed away from the sink, turning his back on the mirror. The bed creaked as he sat down, the springs protesting under his weight. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, his hands hanging limply between his legs. The flickering light cast his shadow on the wall, a dark, twisted shape that seemed to mock him. It seemed to grow horns, then a smile he recognized all too much from his childhood. He knew his mind was making these things up, a lack of sleep would do that to you, but it didn't make it any less real to him. There was no going back. No escape. Only the next fight, the next challenge, the next step forward in this endless descent. Izuku closed his eyes, shutting out the world, and let the silence consume him. Chapter 9, The Rot in Your Veins. Izuku's knuckles hit the bag with a dull thud, a rhythmic cadence that matched the steady rhythm of his breathing. His breath came in slow, controlled puffs as he moved around the bag, eyes fixed on the worn surface in front of him. His feet shuffled, barely lifting off the ground, each step purposeful, calculated. He shifted his weight, pivoted, threw a sharp jab, then followed it with a cross, his body rotating with the punch to maximize its impact. The skin on his knuckles was already raw, the friction from the heavy bag biting into it, but he paid it no mind. The pain was distant, almost irrelevant, a familiar companion in these moments. He wasn't here to stay comfortable, he was here to get better. To fight better. He adjusted his stance, watching the way his feet aligned, the way his hips followed the movement of his torso, ensuring everything was in sync. He'd seen other fighters move like this, professionals, seasoned veterans who made each strike look effortless. Izuku wasn't there yet, but he was getting closer. Each match in the ring taught him something new, each fighter he faced showed him another angle, another approach. A roundhouse kick snapped out, the air around his leg hissing before the impact sent the bag swaying violently. He followed through, not just with the kick but with the next step, regaining his balance, preparing for the next attack. The bag swung back, and he was already moving, sidestepping as if avoiding a counterattack, then darting in with a rapid combination. His mind ran through the lessons learned. Don't give the opponent a stationary target. His body responded with muscle memory, honed over months of practice, of relentless training that pushed his limits further and further. He couldn't afford to be slow, to hesitate. Hesitation meant defeat, and defeat in the ring was more than just a loss, it was survival in a world that didn't care how hard you tried, only how hard you hit back. He slammed another fist into the bag, the force behind it causing a sharp pain to radiate up his arm. His bones rattled, but he welcomed it, pushed through it. The pain was good. The pain meant he was alive, that he was still here, still fighting. He wasn't soft, wasn't weak like he used to be. He was carving away the parts of himself that couldn't survive here, molding what was left into something stronger, more dangerous. His thoughts were interrupted by the muffled sound of an announcer calling out the next match. He ignored it for now, focusing on the rhythm he had built, the movement of his body, the swing of the bag. He didn't need to think about the match, about the opponent waiting for him just beyond the door. All that mattered was what he did in the moment, what he'd been doing for months now, surviving. He delivered a final blow, a solid right hook that sent the bag spinning on its chain, and stepped back, breathing heavily. The muscles in his arms and legs tingled with exertion, sweat dripping down his face, but he wasn't tired. Not yet. Not ever. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, smearing the sweat across his skin, and let his gaze drift toward the door. The ring waited. His next opponent waited. Izuku cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp in the dimly lit room, and rolled his shoulders. It was time to fight. Again. He couldn't lie that there was a pounding in his chest as he was led into the ring, the noise growing louder with each step. The walls of the narrow corridor pressed in on him, closing in, forcing himself to be reminded that there was no turning back on this. He'd fought in this ring more times than he could count, but tonight was different. Tonight, he was facing someone new. Someone he hadn't faced since the first day they met, someone who was strong, faster, and infinitely more skilled than him in every way imaginable. The Butcher. Even the name sent a shiver down his spine, even though he hated to admit it. Izuku had heard the stories, everyone had. The man was a legend of the ring, undefeated, an unstoppable force. And now, Izuku was expected to go toe-to-toe with him. Well, more like survive him. He tried to push down the fear bubbling up inside him, to remind himself that he'd survived worse, that he'd come too far to let some man he's never met intimidate him. But the unease lingered, stayed swirling around, a cold knot in his gut that wouldn't go away. When he was tossed into the ring, the noise had hit him like a physical force, nearly knocking him off balance. It was deafening, a roar of excitement and bloodlust that reverberated through his skull, making his vision blur at the edges. Izuku staggered only for a moment, disoriented, before forcing his eyes to focus. He couldn't afford to be distracted, not now. He couldn't afford to let fear rule him, to let weakness control his actions. It would cost him more than victory that night. The Butcher was already there, standing across the ring with his arms crossed and eyes closed as if he was bored with the entire affair. Izuku dwarfed him, but his presence filled the space between them, his aura drawing the air around him in and making Izuku have to work harder to breathe. The man didn't need to project his strength, it radiated from him, an invisible force that made Izuku's muscles involuntarily tense up. The announcer's voice boomed over the statusy speakers, listing the fighters' records, but Izuku barely heard it. His gaze was locked on the Butcher, on the calm, composed way he stood there, as if this was just another day in the office for him. It was unnerving if nothing else. Izuku had fought plenty of confident opponents, but this was something else entirely. The man didn't just believe he would win, he knew it. Izuku's fist clenched at his sides, his knuckles still a little raw and bruising from his earlier warm-up. He couldn't let the Butcher get inside his head. He had to focus, had to find a way to get through this, just like he has with everything else. The announcer's voice droned on, but his attention was on the Butcher's movements, or rather, the lack of them. The man hadn't budged an inch since he'd entered the ring, hadn't even opened his eyes. When the announcer finally fell silent, the crowd erupted into cheers, the sound hammering into Izuku's skull. He grit his teeth, resisting the urge to move away from the noise and cover his ears. Showing any sign of weaknesses to exploit would be a mistake, a fatal one. The Butcher would notice, and he wouldn't hesitate to exploit it. The moment of silence stretched on, a tension-filled second before the Butcher cracked his neck to the side, opening his eyes slowly. Izuku's muscles tensed involuntarily, his body coiled like a spring. He figured the Butcher was waiting for him to make the first move. He didn't want to, but it wasn't like he had much of a choice in the matter. Standing still would only prolong the inevitable, and if he hesitated any longer, he'd be giving the Butcher even more of an advantage. With that said, Izuku launched himself forward in a straight dash, his body a blur of motion. His fist was ped back, ready to strike with all the power he could muster. But before he could even register what was happening, he was airborne and the world around him was upside down. There was a sharp pain in his back as he was slammed into the concrete floor of the ring, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Izuku gasped, eyes blown wide, his mind struggling to catch up with his body. The Butcher had moved so fast that Izuku hadn't seen it coming. He forced himself to roll to the side, barely managing to avoid a boot that came crashing down where his head had been moments ago. His vision doubled as he scrambled to his feet, swaying as he tried to find his balance. The Butcher was already advancing, his expression void of any type of emotion, his movements methodical and calculated. There was no hesitation in the way he closed the distance, no wasted effort. Izuku barely had time to get himself back into a fighting stance before the next attack came, a sweeping kick directed at his legs. Pain exploded in his knees as they buckled, a sharp, tearing sensation that left him reeling. He hit the ground again, his legs snapping beneath him. His regeneration kicked in almost immediately, the bones fusing back together with an audible crack, but it hadn't been enough time to make a major difference. The butcher was already on him again, his fist smashing into Izuku's face with bone-shattering force. Izuku's vision went white with pain, his head snapping back as the blow connected. Every time Izuku managed to find his footing, another shot to his body would send him crashing down again. His bones were broken and healed so many times that he lost count, the pain blurring together in a continuous, agonizing ache. The butcher seemed to know exactly where to hit to inflict the most pain on Izuku, targeting his head whenever possible. Each strike was calculated, precise, and designed to maximize damage while giving Izuku no time to recover. He tried to find an opening, a moment to counterattack, but it was as if those kinds of things didn't exist. The butcher's defense was impenetrable to him, his movements too fast, too fluid. Every time Izuku thought he saw a gap, it closed before he could act on it, leaving him vulnerable to another devastating blow. His regeneration, which he relied on heavily during his fights, was quickly becoming a curse. It drained him, sapped his energy with each injury he had to heal himself from. He could feel himself getting weaker, his movements slowing as exhaustion set in. The butcher never let up, never gave him a moment to breathe. It was like being trapped in a nightmare, one where no matter how hard he fought, he was always one step behind, always on the verge of losing. And then, as if to add insult to injury, he felt that hunger pulling at his stomach, that emptiness that had haunted him as a child, and for that moment, he was 4 years old again, hurt and starving. For a moment, the butcher's face started to blur, to shift into something else, something terrifyingly familiar. Inko. His mother. Her eyes were bright with anger, filled with the same disdain he'd seen so many times before. She wasn't supposed to be here, but there she was, staring at him with a look that said she wished he'd never been born. Izuku's breath got caught in his throat, panic surging through him. He lunged at her without thinking, his instincts taking over. His teeth bared, his mind blank with rage and fear, he went for her throat, desperate to silence that look, to make it go away. The butcher's hand came down like a hammer, backhanding Izuku with such force that he was sent flying across the ring. He crashed into the metal cage, the impact sending shockwaves throughout his entire body. Teeth clattered to the ground, quickly growing back, but the pain was still there, throbbing in his jaw. He was on all fours next, his mind still locked on the image of his mother, of those angry, unforgiving eyes. He pushed himself up, his body trembling, but he made himself lunge at her again, attacking with a ferocity that bordered on madness. His claws tore into her pale flesh, but it wasn't enough. He needed to do more, to rip her apart, to finally make her pay for all the pain she'd ever caused him. The crowd is nothing but a frenzied blur of faces, some cheering, others screaming in outrage. Money changes hands, a voice crackles through the speakers again, the same voice, the announcer's voice, a fever-pitched mix of disbelief and awe. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't believe what I just saw. The butcher, the undefeated butcher has fallen. Mutt has done the impossible, and in the most brutal fashion we've ever witnessed. This kid, he's something else, folks. He's a monster in the ring. Izuku's vision was still hazy, his mind still not yet caught up with the aftermath of everything. The pain in his body was nothing more than a dull throb, his regeneration already working overtime to mend the fractures and other internal damage. But it's not fast enough. He's been pushing himself too hard for too long, and his body's on dangerously low reserves. He wasn't sure how much longer he would be able to keep this up. A group of men, decked out in heavy-duty protective gear, storm into the ring. Their faces are hidden behind the dark visors of their helmets, their movements jerky and frantic, their weapons gleaming in the low lighting as they rush towards the cage. Izuku's instinct is to fight, to lash out and defend himself from these oncoming threats, but his muscles are sluggish, his reactions dulled by exhaustion and the lingering effects of months of strenuous activity with no break. Even if he had the ability to fight back at the moment, they didn't give him a chance to resist. Tasers crackled, and electricity surged throughout his body, locking up his muscles and sending him sprawling to the ground with a resounding thud. He convulses when the probes hit him, teeth gritted as pain shot throughout his nervous system, but he felt too physically drained to fight back. He's barely conscious as they dragged him out of the ring, his vision darkening at the edges, the jeering crowd falling on ringing ears. The next thing he knows, he's being dumped into the waiting area, the cold concrete sending a shiver through his whole body. Four men loom over him, their voices muffled by the lingering ringing in his ears. "Get your money and get the hell out of here, kid. Don't come back. Ever." They're gone before he can even respond, leaving him alone in the room with the flickering lights and the one window to see out onto the streets. Izuku's body feels like it's made of lead, every bit of movement he makes sends spikes of pain into his bones. But he forces himself to stand, his legs trembling beneath him as he stumbles over to a table where his winnings were waiting. The stack of bills is hefty, more than he's ever seen in his life, but it feels empty in his hands. He stuffs it into his pocket without counting it, too numb to care. His thoughts weren't together much better than his physical state. He couldn't process anything, just numb, hollow. But, he was always hollow, wasn't he? He shouldn't have expected to feel any different. The walk back to his abandoned house is a blur. He doesn't remember exactly how he got there, just that by the time he collapses onto the mattress, the sun is starting to rise. He's too tired to sleep, his mind racing as he stares up at the cracked ceiling, the events of the night replaying in his head over and over again. Izuku doesn't remember falling asleep. One moment, he's staring up at the cracked ceiling, replaying the night over and over in his head, and the next, he's waking up, a sharp, gnawing pain twisting in his gut. It's a sensation that's all too familiar now, a hunger that claws at him from the inside out, demanding to be fed. The mattress beneath him is damp with sweat, his body heavy and stiff as if he's been lying there for days. And maybe he has. Time feels slippery, hard to grasp. The light filtering through the broken windows has shifted, and the air smells different, stale, like it's been sitting still for too long. It has been too long. Pushing himself up, Izuku sways, the room tilting around him. His stomach churns, a deep, primal need surging through him. He's felt this before, of course, countless times previous to this particular instance, when he was younger and his mother wouldn't buy enough food for him, when he first started living on the streets and had to scavenge for scraps. It's a hunger that gnaws at his insides, making his vision blur and his thoughts scatter, reduced to one singular focus: eat. He stumbles to his feet, the world swirling around him. His body moves on autopilot, instincts taking over as he fumbles for a fresh pair of clothes, his shoes, everything he needed to get out of this suffocating space and onto the street. The hunger drives him, overriding everything else. There's no room for anything but the need to satisfy this craving, to fill the void gnawing away at him. Outside, the streets are eerily quiet, the city still in that strange, pre-dawn limbo. Izuku's feet carry him through familiar alleyways and side streets, the path ingrained in his memory from countless nights spent roaming these same routes. He doesn't know where he's going, only that he needs to find something, anything, to quell the hunger before it drives him mad. Every shadow seems to pulse with life, every sound amplified in the stillness of the early morning. Izuku's senses are heightened, his mind zeroing in on anything that might resemble food. His gaze lingers on a stray cat darting into an alley, the thought of sinking his teeth into its flesh momentarily flickering in his mind before he shakes it off, disgusted with himself. The creature ran away before he could even give it more consideration. But the hunger doesn't care about disgust or morality. It's a living, breathing thing inside him, screaming to be fed. And Izuku knows, deep down, that if he doesn't find something soon, he won't be able to control it. He's been here before, more times than he can count. The edge of desperation, the line between man and beast blurring as survival instincts kick in. But this time, it's different. This time, he's stronger, faster, more dangerous. He can feel it in his bones, the power coursing through him, the result of everything he's been through, everything he's done. The sun is just starting to rise, casting a pale light over the city as Izuku rounds a corner, eyes scanning the area. He catches sight of a trash bin outside a convenience store, the lid slightly askew. Without hesitation, he's on it, ripping it open and tearing through the bags inside, searching for anything remotely edible. He finds a half-eaten sandwich, the bread stale and the meat questionable, but it doesn't matter. He devours it in seconds, barely chewing, just enough to keep from choking as he shoves more into his mouth. The taste is awful, the bread rotten and foul, but it's something, a temporary relief from the burning in his stomach. As he crouches there, scarfing down scraps like a wild animal, a part of him wonders how he got here. Not just to this moment, but to this point in his life, where he's so far gone, so consumed by this endless hunger and need for survival that nothing else matters. The illegal ring, the fights, scavenging for scraps like the stray dogs he used to chase away from his mother's doorstep. And he knows, with a sick certainty, that he can't go back. He's not welcome there anymore, his time in the ring cut short after the butcher. He's too dangerous, too unpredictable, a liability they can't afford. But that doesn't matter now. All that matters is getting through this, pushing past the hunger until it fades, until he can think clearly again. It takes hours, maybe more. He doesn't know, time blurs together as he stumbles through the city, eating whatever he can find, stealing from stores and trash bins, his senses dulled by exhaustion and the single-minded drive to survive. By the time he drags himself back to the abandoned house, the sun is high in the sky, and his stomach has settled into a dull ache instead of a burning pit. He collapses onto the mattress again, the world spinning around him as his body finally starts to shut down, the last embers of adrenaline fading. His mind drifts, the hunger still there, but muted now, less urgent. It was quiet, for the time being. He closes his eyes, letting the darkness pull him under, not knowing how long it'll be before he wakes up again. The days pass in a haze after that, weeks bleeding into each other as Izuku struggles to find a new routine. The ring is out of the question now, but he still needs money, still needs to survive. He picks up odd jobs, whatever he can find, using the skills he's honed over the years to get by. It's not much, but it's enough to keep him afloat. 5 months pass like this, the hunger always lurking in the background, never fully satisfied but kept at bay. Izuku feels himself changing, growing harder, colder, more detached from the boy he used to be. The night before the UA entrance exam, he lies awake on the same mattress, staring up at the ceiling once more. The hunger is there, as always, but so is something else, a determination, a fire that hasn't been extinguished, despite everything. Tomorrow is the start of something new. And no matter what, he'll survive, because no one, or thing, will stand in his way of becoming a hero. Chapter 10, Does Your Flesh Not Rot? Izuku moved swiftly from rooftop to rooftop, his feet barely touching the surface before he propelled himself to the next. It had become a habit by now, avoiding the crowded streets of Mizurufu. Interacting with the people there was an ordeal he preferred to skip altogether. People stared too much, and when they didn't, their averted eyes were just as telling. So, the rooftops had become his highway, isolated and free from the burden of others' gazes. As UA high school came into view, he slowed to a stop at the edge of a building. The sight before him was nothing short of awe-inspiring. The large, towering glass building gleamed in the sunlight, a beacon of heroism and prestige. The U logo in gold above the gates shone with an almost divine light. UA High. The name alone carried the weight of legends, All Might, Edge Shot, Best Genist, and Endeavor. They all started here, learned here from the greatest heroes of their day. And one day, he clenched his fists, they'd be saying the same about him. That went without saying. With that thought driving him, he strode forward, confidence in every step. But as fate would have it, a loose brick underfoot had other plans. It slipped, throwing off his balance, and for a split second, he was on the verge of a faceplant. Yet, with quick reflexes, he caught himself, his other foot planting firmly on the ground. A quick glance around confirmed no one had seen his stumble, or so he thought. As he craned his neck to look behind him, his gaze met with a girl extending her hand out toward him, just shy of touching his back. She was short, especially in comparison to him, with brown hair and pink ovals on her cheeks. The moment their eyes met, Izuku recoiled instinctively, his body snapping back as if he'd been burned. The girl's eyes widened in surprise, and she quickly retracted her hand, letting it fall to her side as she fidgeted awkwardly. "Ah, sorry about that," she blurted out, her voice light and friendly. "I just didn't want you to fall on your first day. That'd be bad luck, you know. But, it looks like you've got it covered." She paused, her cheeks turning a light shade of pink that matched the ovals on her face. "I'm Uraraka Ochiko, by the way." She offered a small, nervous smile when he made no attempt at a response, and then began shifting her weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Well, I hope the next time we see each other, it's as heroes in training." And with that, she turned and practically sprinted into the building, leaving Izuku standing there, still processing the encounter. It had been so long since someone had spoken to him in such a cheerful, friendly tone. The way she smiled, the way her voice carried a lightness, it reminded him of someone. A woman from his past. The memory sent a chill through him, darkening his mood in an instant. Snapping out of his stupor, he shoved his hands in his pockets and walked into U.A.'s halls, his previous confidence dimmed but not extinguished. He followed the floor signs, leading him to a large-scale auditorium. The room was massive, with multiple floors and countless rows of chairs. He scanned the area, noting that all the seats were taken except for one. Unfortunately, it was next to Katsuki. Izuku muttered a curse under his breath as he slid into the chair, ignoring the heated glare Katsuki shot in his direction. Instead, his attention shifted to the man standing on the stage under the spotlight. Blonde, but not like Katsuki, this one's hair was styled like a cockatoo's crest, and he wore sunglasses indoors. His presence was loud, almost overwhelming. "Welcome to the U.A. entrance exam, little listeners." The man's voice filled the entire room with the help of the small speakers on his shoulders, a grin splitting his face. Izuku recognized him instantly, Present Mike, the pro-hero known for his popular radio show. Izuku didn't have much of an opinion on him, but he could respect the hero's charity work and his contribution to the community. "Today's the day you all show us what you're made of." Present Mike continued, his voice carrying an infectious energy. "Now, let's talk about the practical portion of the exam. We'll be conducting mock battles in foe cities, but you'll be split up from people from your junior highs. That's right, listeners, it's time to show us what you can do in a real-world scenario." He paused, letting the information sink in. "You've got 10 minutes to use your quirks to immobilize as many robotic villains as you can. Each villain bot you take down will score you points based on its difficulty level. The more points you rack up, the better your chances of getting into U.A. Present Mike pointed to a screen behind him, where images of various armored robots appeared. "Here's the breakdown, listeners. We've got 1-pointers, your basic baddies. Easy peasy. Then, 2-pointers, these guys are a bit tougher. You might need to put some elbow grease into it. And finally, the 3-pointers, now these are the real deal. They're hard, but the points are worth it." The screen then showed an image of a massive bot, towering over the others. "And last but not least, we've got the arena traps. These big bad bots are here to trip you up. They're massive, they're tough, and they're worth." Present Mike paused for dramatic effect, then grinned. 0 points. That's right. No points for taking these guys on. They're here to weed out those who can't handle the pressure, so don't waste your time trying to fight them." Izuku's eyes narrowed at that. Something not worth the time. Something made to be avoided. He couldn't help but feel a spark of excitement at that sentiment. And that's the lowdown. All you gotta do is go above and beyond and give it your all. Present Mike shouted, raising a fist into the air. Now, on the count of 3, I want to hear you all say it with me. 1, 2, 3, plus ultra. The room erupted with energy as the majority of examinees shouted, plus ultra, in unison, jumping from their seats and rushing towards the exits in a deafening roar of cheers. Izuku and Katsuki remained seated, the only two not swept up in the collective fervor. When the auditorium had mostly emptied out, Katsuki stood up, brushing past Izuku without so much as a glance. But before he left, he threw a final remark over his shoulder, his voice dripping with disdain. You shouldn't even be here. Pray they don't take one good look at you and arrest you on the spot, you shitty villain. Izuku watched as Katsuki left the auditorium, the door swinging shut behind him. He'd show Katsuki. He stood up with a determined look in his eyes, lips falling into a slight frown. He'd show everyone who ever dared to doubt him. Izuku's anger simmered beneath the surface as he stalked toward the locker room, his mind still reeling from Katsuki's parting words. The door creaked open, and the packed room fell silent as he entered. Everyone seemed to know better than to cross him today. Their gazes flicked nervously between him and their belongings as they hurriedly made space, avoiding eye contact with a clearly agitated Izuku. He quickly stripped off his too-tight junior high uniform, starting with the briefs, which he switched for sweatpants. His black jacket followed, and finally, the tank top he wore underneath. The moment it was off, a few low gasps echoed in the room. Izuku's head shot up, catching the wide-eyed stares directed at his heavily scarred torso. He felt a surge of irritation, his instinct to lash out bubbling to the surface. Before he could snap at them for staring, one boy with spiky red hair spoke up, his voice a mix of curiosity and shame. How'd you get all those scars? The boy quickly backpedaled, looking embarrassed. Sorry, that was really unmanly of me to ask. It's probably a sensitive subject. Izuku glared for a moment before throwing his tank top back on. Without a word, he stalked out of the locker room, his black jacket slung over his shoulder. The crowded room seemed to exhale collectively once he was gone. The bus ride to the testing site was silent. Izuku sat near the back, away from the others, who kept a safe distance. As they approached the site, massive concrete walls loomed into view, topped by an equally massive gate. The faux city behind them was almost laughable in its size, towering over even Izuku. He couldn't help but let out a bark of laughter at the sight. The sound drew more stares, but he ignored them. As the bus came to a halt and the students began to unload, Izuku lingered, the last to step off. He took in the sight of the testing area, feeling the weight of anticipation settle over him. He could practically taste the tension in the air, the unspoken challenge presented by the looming cityscape. Suddenly, a hand clamped down on his shoulder, and Izuku's first instinct was to retaliate. His muscles tensed, and his eyes flashed dangerously as he turned to face whoever dared to touch him. It was a guy with short blue hair, his expression set in an arrogant scowl. Izuku shrugged off his hand, glaring down at him. Do you make it a habit of grabbing people you don't know? The guy looked taken aback, his robotic-like chopping motions betraying a rigid sense of righteousness. No. Oh, of course not. That type of behavior would be unheroic. But you, he cleared his throat, pointing accusingly at Izuku, are not taking this exam seriously. You're treating it like a joke, and I won't allow anyone to make a mockery of you, eh? Izuku's patience was thinning rapidly. He leaned in closer, towering over the blue-haired boy. I would worry about yourself, he growled, his voice low and threatening. Before the confrontation could escalate, Present Mic's voice blared over the loudspeakers, giving the signal to start the exam. Without missing a beat, Izuku shot through the stone gates, leaving the blue-haired guy to gape at his back. Go, go, go. Present Mic's voice echoed through the mock city. Don't waste time, little listeners. Izuku didn't waste a second. His senses sharpened as he moved through the city with terrifying speed, his claws out and ready. He quickly located small groups of villain bots scattered throughout the area, a mix of 1, 2, and 3-point villains. He tore through them with ruthless efficiency, his claws slicing through metal like it was paper. Sparks flew as his hands dug into the robot's electronic insides, the sharp jolt of electricity barely registering as his wounds healed almost instantly. He allowed his heightened senses to guide him, picking up on the whirring gears and mechanical groans of the villain bots hidden around corners and behind walls. Minutes passed, and the sounds of other participants engaging the remaining bots reached his ears. Izuku didn't care. He was in his own world, focused solely on racking up as many points as possible. But then, the ground beneath him trembled, and a deafening explosion rocked the city. Izuku's instincts flared, immediately recognizing the source, the zero-pointer. He abandoned the group of bots he was dismantling and turned toward the noise. The massive robot was easy to spot, towering above the foe city's buildings like a metal titan. Participants were fleeing from it in droves, their fear palpable in the air. As Izuku approached, a hand grabbed his shoulder again. He shrugged it off with a growl, but this time, it was the red-haired boy from the locker room. "The zero-pointer's coming this way. You've gotta run," the boy shouted, panic in his voice. Izuku shot him a scornful look before he pushed forward, the red-haired boy's protests fading into the background. As he neared the colossal robot, excitement stirred in his chest, a thrill he hadn't felt in a long time. This was his chance to see just how strong he really was. With a burst of speed, Izuku sprinted toward the zero-pointer and leaped into the air, landing halfway up one of its massive legs. His claws dug into the metal, anchoring him as he scaled the robot with swift, powerful movements. He reached the top of its head in seconds, taking a moment to survey the city below before driving his fists into the robot's head. Each punch dented the metal further until he reached the internal systems. The wires were thicker here, but that didn't stop him. When his claws proved ineffective, Izuku resorted to biting into the cables, tearing through them with his teeth despite the searing pain of electricity coursing through his body. The robot hissed out steam at its joints before it came grinding to a halt, its systems fried. Izuku's muscles twitched uncontrollably as the last of the electricity left his body and he swayed to his unsteady feet. He punched his way out of the robot's head, this time taking a bit longer as his still twitching arms caused some difficulties, but debris raining down as he leaped to a nearby building. Instead of landing on the roof, he slammed into the side of the structure, his claws digging into the concrete to slow his descent. His hand was a mess of exposed bone and charred flesh, but Izuku watched in morbid fascination as the muscle and skin slowly regenerated. The grotesque display held his attention until Present Mic's voice once again echoed through the city. "Time's up. The practical exam is over. Head back to the entrance." Izuku glanced around, the stunned expressions of the other participants making it clear that they had witnessed his feat as he made his way back. He noticed a small old lady he hadn't seen before, her eyes sharp and discerning despite her age. She had to be a pro-hero, but Izuku didn't dwell on it. He had more important things to focus on, namely, the written portion of UA's entrance exam. Izuku's muscles ached with the familiar dull pain of regeneration as he climbed back onto the bus. The adrenaline that had fueled him through the practical exam was wearing off, leaving him with a heavy sense of fatigue. He collapsed into his seat at the back, letting out a long, weary breath as he reached into the bag he'd left on the bus. The bento box he pulled out was cold against his hand as he pulled it out, its contents nearly as unsettling as the meal itself. He snapped the lid open, revealing the raw beef and nearly rotten sashimi inside. The smell hit him immediately, sharp and pungent, but it was nothing compared to the intense hunger gnawing at his insides. The sashimi's sickly sheen didn't bother him, in fact, it looked almost appetizing to his monstrous appetite. He picked up a piece of fish, ignoring the slight give of the flesh that indicated it was nearing the end of its shelf life, and popped it into his mouth. The taste was rancid, sour on his tongue, but it didn't make him GG. Instead, the hunger overpowered everything else, and he devoured the sashimi in silence, quickly finishing it before the rest of the students started boarding the bus. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, then moved on to the It wasn't until he'd eaten nearly all of it that he began to feel somewhat sated. He cleaned up quickly, shoving the empty bento back into his backpack just as the other students started filing in. They were quieter now, subdued after the grueling test. Some were chatting in hushed tones, but most were too exhausted to do more than slump in their seats. Izuku leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes for a moment. The faint thrum of the bus engine and the murmur of voices became a dull background noise as his mind drifted. His body was still healing, his nerves tingling with the unpleasant sensation of his cells knitting back together. By the time the bus returned to U.A.'s main campus, the fatigue had settled deep into his bones, but there was no time to rest. Izuku dragged himself off the bus, straightened his jacket over his shoulder, and headed to the exam hall. The written exam awaited, and though he was far more drained than he wanted to admit, his mind snapped into focus as he entered the classroom. Hours later, Izuku stepped out of the front gates, the fresh air hitting him like a cold splash of water. He'd changed back into his school uniform at some point, though he hadn't bothered to put his jacket back on, which hung loosely over his shoulder from two of his fingers, swaying with each step. Around him, the other participants milled about, talking amongst themselves. Some were beaming with confidence, already bragging about their imminent acceptance into the hero course. Others looked crestfallen, muttering regrets about not studying enough or not practicing their quirks more. Izuku did his best to filter out the noise, focusing instead on the fact that he might have actually passed the written portion of the exam. The cram school had helped him more than he'd expected. As he walked, a familiar voice caught his attention. He subtly glanced around, easily spotting the source over the sea of students. The spiky red-haired guy from earlier was talking to a girl with pink hair, pink skin, and small horns. Izuku strained to listen, curious despite himself. There was this tall, scary-looking dude in my section, the red-haired guy was saying with an oddly enthusiastic tone. But he's super manly. He fought the big robot present Mike told us to avoid just so he could save a girl from being crushed, even though it was worth 0 points. I'm kind of jealous, honestly. I mean, that's really manly. The girl, who Izuku now realized must be the red-haired guy's friend, laughed softly. Stop comparing yourself to others, Kirishima, she chided gently. You're brave too, you know. You always do what's right, and that's what really matters. Izuku's ears felt warm as he tuned out the rest of their conversation. He didn't need to hear more. The way they talked reminded him of how good friends from junior high might sound, comfortable and supportive. A strange feeling twisted in his chest, something akin to envy but mixed with something darker. He took out those negative feelings bubbling in his chest on the loose brick that had made him trip only a few hours ago, a satisfying sensation washing over him as it crumbled beneath the heel of his shoe. He shook it off, his attention shifting to his next destination, a nearby butcher shop. The exam had left him drained, and he figured he deserved a treat, even if it was just a small one. He walked off, blending into the crowd of students until he was out of sight. The observation room was bathed in the cool glow of dozens of wall-mounted televisions, each screen showing a different angle of the now deserted mock cities. The aftermath of the practical exam was laid bare, rubble, smoking remains of robots, and one particularly impressive sight, a destroyed 0-pointer. In the center of the room, seated in a plush desk chair, was a small, white, rodent-like creature. Principal Nizu's beady, but sharp, black eyes took in everything on the screens, his expression unreadable as he was sipping on a steaming cup of tea. Principal Nizu, came a voice from behind the creature. A man clad in a black jumpsuit with a white bandage-like scarf draped over his shoulder stepped into the light, his yellow goggles hanging loosely around his neck. It was Aizawa Shoda, Eraserhead, his tired eyes narrowing as he scanned the carnage on the screens. This year's full of a bunch of problem children, he sighed. I assume you're giving me the most problematic ones. Like always, Nizu hummed in agreement, flipping through a folder on his lap. It certainly seems that way, Aizawa. Each year brings new challenges, but this one, he trailed off, eyes lingering on the destroyed 0-pointer. He turned slightly in his chair to address another figure in the room, a sickeningly thin but tall man with blonde hair and hollowed-out blue eyes. To answer your question from earlier, Toshinori, Nizu began, his tone contemplative, as if he was trying to choose his words carefully. The student who destroyed the zero-pointer is Izuku Midoriya. It's been about a decade since I last saw him, but he's certainly grown up a lot since then. And not only in height, that is. Toshinori, or rather Toshinori Yagi, nodded slowly, his expression distant. Midoriya Izuku. I see. Nizu's gaze shifted back to Aizawa. As you said, you'll be taking him this year, Aizawa. He's special. I'm sure you know. Aizawa's eyes narrowed further, suspicion flickering across his features. What makes you say that? Before Nizu could respond, another voice joined the conversation, a broad man with short white hair standing off to the side. Aizawa always gets all the most promising kids, he grumbled. Nizu, you're showing favoritism to Class 1A again. Calm down, Nizu replied, his voice even. You'll be getting plenty of strong hero candidates. But Midoriya, he's going to be a handful, even by Aizawa's standards. Sekijiro Kan's, pro-hero Vlad King's, eyebrows shot up. Why? Oh. I haven't told you all yet, have I? Nizu perked up from his seat, setting down his teacup. That's because Izuku Midoriya should really be locked up in Tartarus for mass murder, he said rather nonchalantly. I've been covering up the information from the public since he was 4 years old. To give him a chance at a normal childhood. The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of Nizu's words hanging heavy in the air. The screens continued to flicker, the destroyed remains of the zero-pointer a stark reminder of the power, and the danger, that Izuku Midoriya possessed. What the hell were they about to get themselves into? Could something, like that even be trained? Nizu's declaration hung heavy in the air, casting a dark shadow over the observation room. The pro-heroes exchanged uneasy glances, their faces reflecting the gravity of Nizu's words. It's true, yes, that Midoriya should really be behind bars for mass murder, Nizu said, his tone uncharacteristically grave. It was his quirk awakening. The event happened when he was just 4 years old. That day, he killed just over 20 people. It was a horrific incident, one that left a permanent mark on the city of Mizudafu as we know it. Kan's eyes widened in disbelief. You're telling us this child, this candidate for you, and a possible hero in training, is a mass murderer. How could you even think of letting him into the hero course? Nizu's expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained sharp. It was a tragic accident, one he had no control over. A child with a newly awakened and incredibly powerful quirk. I couldn't let the public know about it. So, I pulled every string I could, working behind the scenes to have the information erased from public records. The Hero Public Safety Commission was really instrumental in all of this. Any and all information regarding that incident has been completely destroyed. Even I don't have a copy of any reports done that day. Toshinori Yagi, his normally cheerful demeanor replaced with a somber one, spoke up. But why would you bring someone like Midoriya into you, Even if he's strong, isn't he a risk to everyone around him? That seems too big a risk to take, even for you, Principal Nizu. Toshinori, Nizu's gaze was steady as he answered. Consider this, would you rather have such a powerful individual as an enemy, someone with the potential and every reason to want to turn to villainy, or would you prefer to have them on our side, under the guidance and tutelage of you, teachers and alumni? If we have the chance to channel all of his raw abilities, shape his path, and direct his strength toward heroism rather than destruction, we gain a formidable ally for all of our efforts. Nizu picked up his teacup again, tipping it back to take a long sip from it. If you really think about this, the danger isn't in the person, but in how we choose to handle them. Don't you agree? The room fell silent once again, the weight of Nizu's reasoning sinking in. Kan and Toshinori exchanged looks of reluctant acceptance, their initial shock beginning to wear off. Nizu clapped his hands together, breaking the silence. But enough of this for today. The next year promises to be full of challenges and opportunities, and we must be prepared. Each of you will have your role to play in shaping these students into Japan's next generation of heroes. I can already feel that this year is going to be particularly interesting. With that, Nizu dismissed the gathered pro-heroes, each of them absorbed in their thoughts as they began to leave the observation room. The screens continued to flicker with the aftermath of the practical exams, a reminder of the tumultuous path that lay ahead for both you and its newest, most controversial student.